Hello everybody, this is Brian O'Haron. This Some Local History series is dedicated to my lovely wife, Joyce Bagnaschi O'Haron, who loved everybody and was friends with everybody in turn, and had no enemies, just friends. She was admired throughout her worldly travels. She was a special person, respected by all. The Ringling brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus, in July of 1944, caught on fire, and the circus band began to play this song to warn everybody. You just heard John Philip Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever, which will have major significance in this program. In July of 1944, I was 6 years old, and my brother Dennis was 4 1/2 years old, when my father and mother told us that we were going to go, along with a cousin, Susan Carter, from Chicopee, Massachusetts, to Hartford, Connecticut, to see the greatest show on earth, the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus. We were delighted. My cousin was staying with my father's sister, my aunt and uncle, Arthur and Kathleen Bruzy, at their summer cottage on Perch Rock Trail on the east shore of Highland Lake, because Susan's mother was having her 7th child. On the day, July 6th, 1944, my brother and I jumped into the rumble seat of my uncle's early model Ford, and my father and mother drove us to Highland Lake, to my aunt and uncle's house, to pick up my cousin Susan. My father took a picture of the 3 cousins in our Sunday best with an old Kodak Brownie camera. You can see this picture. Brian on the left, Susan in the middle, brother Dennis on the right, and we were as happy as clams. We children then jumped into the rumble seat and drove off to Hartford to see the circus. Once in Hartford, my father parked the car at the home of my mother's uncle and aunt across the street from the Hartford Bulkley High School. And we took a bus to the field where the Ringling Brothers tent was pitched. We later found out that the tent was soaked in a waterproofing mixture of paraffin and kerosene, or perhaps gasoline. Once there, we entered the giant circus tent, and we were lucky to have climbed up the green wooden bleachers near the entrance exit, probably a precautionary decision by my mother and father. My mother always wore the customary fashionable high heels of the day and didn't like to climb too high in the bleachers. We sat down where the tent began to pitch towards the roof of the big top. About 20 minutes into the circus, the Great Wallendas were in the middle of performing their famous high wire act, and the performing lions were entering the center ring, as I remember it, through protective chutes from their cages outside the tent. I heard someone yell, "Fire!" It started, many believe, but no one knows for sure, by a carelessly flicked cigarette or perhaps an arsonist. And someone pointed to the far corner in front of me, to the right, at the top of the tent, and I looked up and saw a small amount of fire starting to burn. I can still see it to this day. The ringmaster urged the audience not to panic and to leave in an orderly fashion. But the power failed, and he could not be heard. The circus band leader, who is said to be the first person to spot the flames, immediately began to play "The Stars and Stripes Forever," the song that you heard at the beginning of the program tonight. The tune that you heard tonight, "Stars and Stripes Forever," is traditionally used to signal distress to all circus personnel when there is a problem during the program. The panic began as the crowd began to flee the big top. Luckily, my father and mother did not panic. I'd never known them to panic, and they wasted no time in taking us by the arm and leading us under the bleachers. You can see people, when you see the picture of the fire in the tent, coming out from under the bleachers at the bottom of the tent, following the few others in front of us, who may have pulled the stakes or cut a hole in the tent. I don't remember. I can briefly remember the panic that ensued inside the tent and the attempt to get the lions out through the chutes to their cages. They made it safely while getting a few burns, falling hot paraffin. We were some of the first out of the tent as my father pulled up the bottom of the tent when we got down the stairs, and we got out from underneath. We were very lucky in that respect because we were out very rapidly. We headed across the empty surrounding field at the forefront of most of the survivors. I kept looking back over my shoulder as I ran sideways, holding my father's hand while moving very fast, and I witnessed a lot of the carnage and much of the disaster. I can remember most of it to this day. It took a very short 8 minutes for the tent to burn and about 169 people to perish in various ways. Over 700 people of the approximately 7,500 to 8,000 people present were injured to varying extents. The injured and near dying filled the hospitals in the surrounding areas. I found out later, many years later, when I was much older, that Mrs. Thomas F. Wall and her close cousin, Mary Margaret Cook, from Torrington, were both volunteer nurses helping the victims in Hartford that day and perhaps for many more days after the fire. Several years after the fire, I found out that in addition to my cousin Susan and my brother, my cousins Donna Mary Beecher, who was 7 years old, about the same age as Susan and I, and her younger brother Stephen Michael Beecher, who was 3 years old, were also there the day of the fire, along with their father, Donald Beecher, their grandmother, Olive Beecher, their uncle, Henry Beecher, and his sister, Arlene Beecher Cote. Henry Beecher helped his mother, Olive Beecher, and his sister exit the tent. My cousin Donna also clearly remembers the fear, panic, and the animals performing while the fire was starting. Their family was sitting in an exit row, similar to the way we were sitting in an exit row, when Donna's dad, Donald, realized there was a fire, put his children, Donna and Stephen, one under each arm, and rushed out of the tent safely. Donna's father said, "Don't look back," but Donna did take a look back, much as I did, while running, and saw the whole tent in flames and people exiting the tent. The saddest thing Donna remembers seeing, and she doesn't think that she has ever said this before, was a lady being trampled, and this memory has haunted her during her life ever since. Her father, Donald Beecher, drove to the nearest phone to call their mother, Isabella O'Haron Beecher, my father, Paul James O'Haron's cousin. Donna recently told me that we were all fortunate to be seated in good places. Someone was looking over all of us, said she. We walked rapidly to the nearest bus stop and returned to my mother's, aunt, and uncle's house fast as we could. I don't remember much about that, but a great discussion ensued. My mother's aunt and uncle had 11 children. My mother telephoned my cousin's family and the Bruzy family at Highland Lake, as well as other relatives, to let them know that we were all safe and sound. Many years later, when I wrote about my experience in a paper required for a high school English class, my teacher, Mr. McGrath, didn't believe me. When I mentioned this to my mother, she quickly produced evidence that she had returned the ticket stubs to the circus because they said they would donate a certain amount to charity for each returned ticket stub. She said, "Show the teacher a copy of this document, proving that she had returned the stubs." I did, and the teacher never doubted me again. The famous sad circus clown, Emmett Kelly Jr. character was Weary Willie, invented by his father before him, Emmett Kelly Sr. The sad circus clown was one of the heroes of the fire, being credited with saving many people from the flame. I have a collection of memorabilia that contains the Emmett Kelly Jr. doll that I have here. Once we were in our 20s, Joyce and I were in Lake Tahoe to see a performance by Ella Fitzgerald, and Emmett Kelly Jr. was employed there as a greeter. I thanked him for his heroics during the fire, and many times since then I've wished that I had taken a photograph of him at the time. I have been cautious around fire ever since the circus fire. I dread candles when lit, and I am very careful and uncomfortable around burning fireplaces. I have them cleaned yearly as a precaution, whether they need it or not. I am very appreciative of the firefighters, the hazards that they face, and the dedication and equipment that they need. Many years later, about 57 years or so, my cousin Susan came in from Seattle, Washington, for a visit in Chicopee, Massachusetts, with her family. That's where they were brought up. And they came down to see us at Highland Lake. My brother couldn't make it to that afternoon we had together because he was very ill. And I feel very bad about that because it would have been nice to have the three of us together again for these pictures 57 years after the event. Brian on the left and my cousin Susan. And you'll see a poster they brought, Weary Willie, that saved so many people on the day. There are two girls that were 6 years old when they died, and they're still not identified. That's the same age that Susan and I were at the time of the fire. And they're going to try to check their DNA to find out their identity. The firemen in the Hartford area flowers their graves, two sisters died at 6 years old each year at the time the fire occurred. I met Joyce when she was in high school. She was a junior at the time. And I was home for the summer from Kansas University. One day, I went to the Wall's cottage at Highland Lake. They were my friends. Susan Wall, that was at the circus fire, was the mother, and it was Mr. Wall, and there were three children that both Joyce and I grew up with. Joyce was friendly with one of them. I was friendly with another. So ironically, I met Joyce at the Wall's cottage, and Susan had been in the circus fire. It was love at first sight for both of us. I went back to Kansas to school. She stayed in high school and graduated, where she was a star, of course. Later, after attending Dunbarton College in Washington, D.C., she came out to Kansas and married me. Susan passed while we were married in Kansas University, and we received a note from Mr. Wall, her husband, thanking us for the experiences that we shared together.